day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Storytime on this Sunday. Glad to have you guys here. This story takes place back around the same time period as the last couple stories, and I'm going to call it the Banjo Kick. And the reason why is because my father, it came springtime, early spring in Florida, and I think this was the same year I quit school. So it would make me around, 14 or 15, probably 15 years old. And he got this banjo kick early in the spring, and he started to listen to bluegrass music. And he loved it, my dad. And he went out in this yard sale someplace. I don't know where, but he found this old banjo. And I think he paid like $20 for it. And he started to try to learn how to play it, and he'd listen to these bluegrass songs on the radio, and he started to get very absorbed in it, to say the least, and he would be sitting in the living room picking this old banjo with his fingers, trying to duplicate the songs and stuff that he was listening to. And he kept buying all these bluegrass music, Earl and Scruggs, and all this kind of stuff. Well, back at that time, I was a teenager, and I was all into the popular music of the time. Back at that time, the popular music was things like Elton John and things like, you get the idea. The popular music of that particular time in the 1980s. All the popular songs I was listening to. My dad didn't like that music. He had derogatory names for that particular kind of music that I like to listen to, but I wasn't really all that crazy about the bluegrass music that he was listening to. But anyway, he just kept getting more and more enthused about this stuff. And then he said to my mother, he said, this banjo that I got, he said, I will be able to play an awful lot better if I had a better banjo. And she said, well, what are you going to do about that? She said, banjos are really expensive, the type of banjos you want anyway. Back then, they were like $500. He says, well, that's okay. I'll build one. Well, she said, well, will that cost a lot? He said, no, it won't cost hardly anything. He said, I'll do it practically free. She said, well, okay then. And he was very enthused. So he went on and he started to look in these books and stuff to find out how to build. He went into the music store and stuff, and they had, I think they had a book on building banjos, or someplace he got a book about building banjos, and it said in there, you have to have a bandsaw in order to cut the necks out and to cut the... And so he said, well, I'm going to need a bandsaw, he says to my mother. She says, well, that sounds really expensive. And he says, well, no, I'll build one, he says. She says, well, okay, if you can build one cheap. And he says, I can build it awful cheap and stuff, So he went and he started to look at bandsaws and stuff, and they were expensive. And he studied them, how they were built and everything. And he said, I can build one out of brake rotors off of a car. So he started to go out and gather all these parts and put them in the back shop. In back of the house, he had a little garage there, and he was laying out all these parts on the floor: brake rotors and springs and pieces of metal, and he got this little welder, and he was out in the back shop out there. With this little welder, working for days on this thing, on this project. It was like a scientific laboratory or whatever. I mean, he was out there and he was putting all these little screws together and welding on this and welding on that and welding on this brake rotor and putting these little pieces on it and everything and setting it up as a support and building a table for it. And he got a motor out of an old washing machine, and he was out there tinkering for days. So about a week went by, and every day after work, he'd go out to his shop out there, and he'd start putting these little parts and pieces together and welding on them. And he was really into it, but time passed quick enough. For about a week went by. He says, he come in the house and he says, well, I'm done. I built it. My mother says, really? And he was like, come on, and get me and my mother to come out and take a look at it. Now, look at this. We walked into the garage, and there it was, sitting in the corner, all ready to go. It had a big brake rotor up on the top, and I think it had a brake rotor on the bottom, down below the table he had built out of steel, and the whole thing was built out of steel, the legs, and he welded the whole thing together. It stood about 6 feet tall. A washing machine motor down the bottom underneath the table. A fan belt, an old fan belt, and he had welded some sort of a flywheel on the bottom of the rotor, the brake rotor on the bottom, and the brake rotor on the top. And he'd put a bandsaw blade on it already. And he had it nice and tight about around the two rotors. So he spun it by hand, and it seemed to spin pretty good. And then he says, watch. And he plugged it in. Then he turned it on. It made the awful racket, as it wasn't fully in balance. But it was spinning rather quickly, you know. So he went and grabbed a piece of wood, and he said, watch this. And he ran the piece of wood through. And the thing worked, and it worked good. It sliced straight through that piece of wood like it was butter. And he cut little circles in the wood, a piece of plywood he was cutting. He cut little S shapes in it and everything. And he says, look at that, to my mom. She says, to my dad, she says, you're a genius. She says, that really does work good, you know. So he was all proud. So then came the trip to Orlando. He says, well, I need hardwood. And all he could talk about for about 2 or 3 days there was that he needed a certain type of hardwood. He needed what was called sweet maple or something like that. It was some sort of a hardwood he needed, dried, aged hardwood. So he got on the phone. He called up all around Orlando, and he found this one place where they dealt in hardwood. He went in there, and he was all about buying several blocks of this hardwood that he was going to cut into a neck for his new banjo. So I went into Orlando with my dad, and we were going through, and we were selecting these hardwoods, looking at different kinds of hardwoods in this big warehouse. We found this piece, and he wanted to buy it. A couple pieces of wood, and he wanted to buy it. They were pretty expensive, even back then. And he bought this big block of rosewood, too. He says, this is for the necks. He said, and I think he paid quite a bit for the piece of rosewood. He paid like $40 or something, which back in those days was a lot of money for this piece of rosewood. A piece of rosewood was about 2 inches thick, and it was about, I don't know, maybe 3 feet long, and it was about maybe 12 inches wide, something like that. This big slab of rosewood. And he bought a couple square pieces of this maple. And the maple was expensive, too, for the necks. So he come home with all these parts, and he was putting them together and stuff, and he sent away in the mail then for all these different parts and things that he would need. A brass tone ring, what was called a tone ring, and all these different things for the drum. He sent away for the drum and everything else. And sure enough, over a month or two, about a month, he built this banjo. And when he got the banjo built, he come into the house, you know, and he was like to my mother and me, he says, now listen to this, he said. And he picked up the old banjo he had, bought at the flea market or whatever, and he strummed on it a few times. He says, listen, 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 listen. And then he grabbed his new banjo, and he strummed on it. And he says, oh, can't you hear the difference in the tone? Listen, listen to this. He says, listen. Plung, 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 plung on his original banjo. And then he picked up his new one he built. He says, plung, 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 plung on the new one. He says, now listen, can't you hear the difference? And my mother was like, I don't know. And he says, okay, now listen again. Plung, 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 plung. And then he picked up the one he built. Plung, 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 plung. Can't you hear the difference? Now me, I couldn't hear any difference really much, except the banjo he would built was about twice as loud. It resonated about twice as loud as the banjo that he'd bought. Probably that big brass tone ring in there. But the sound wasn't pretty much exactly the same. It's just it resonated a lot more. But he was really satisfied with it. He says, "Oh, this old banjo, it's no good for nothing. I'm never playing it again. Listen to this." And he plung on his new banjo. Listen to the tone, he said. It's just so beautiful. It sounds as good as, I think he said, a Martin or something, for one of these other banjos he was drooling over. Anyway, so that went on fine, and he was really getting into the bluegrass music even more. He had to send away for a special pair of tuners for his banjo. And I'm going to tell you, every day during that period in time, it was banjo this, banjo that, banjo something else. The windows were open on the house, and you could hear him in there plunking away about 3 hours every evening on this new banjo of his, going over these what do you call it? These repetitious notes like that he was supposed to learn to try to learn these. I forget what they were called. Rolls. I think they were called rolls, banjo rolls. He was practicing day after day after day, and it's kind of like, it's fine when you go to listen to a musician. And you hear it for the first time, and hey, that sounds good and everything, and you enjoy it and everything. But when you got a musician training in your house, and he's really enthused and he can't stop, the music can get rather annoying, especially if it's a certain type of instrument. Like maybe if you got your kids and they're practicing for drums and they're learning how to do drums. Well, drums sound great in the band. But if you're listening to the kid practicing drums for 10 hours a day, after a while it can start to get on your nerves a little bit. And that's the way it was with this banjo. My mother was getting on her nerves something awful. He would sit there over and over and over again. He'd go over these same notes and these same rolls on the banjo. And it seems like he wasn't really getting any better, but he was getting a lot more enthused about trying to get these rolls down correctly and do it just like Earl Scruggs or whatever, And so he says to my mother, now this was getting late in the spring, he says, "It's getting hot here." Mother says, "Yeah, it is. It's getting hot." She says, what about if we take a vacation? My mother smiles. She liked that idea. She says, "That sounds great." Well, it says, "Okay," he says, "in 2 weeks we'll take a vacation, and we're going to head up to the Smoky Mountains, Smoky Mountain National Park, where it's cooler this time of year. Because it's getting pretty hot in Florida by then. It's starting to push toward summer." So after my mother agreed, and okay, we were going to take her vacation in 2 weeks or whatever, my father said to her, he said, "But by the way," he said to my mother the next day, he said, after we'd already decided to go on the vacation and everything else on the Smoky Mountain National Park, he says, "They're having a big bluegrass jamboree up in that area." My dad says, "And I want to go," he said. My mother says, "Bluegrass jamboree?" She says, "Well, what will that be like?" She said, "Does it cost a lot?" He says, No, it doesn't cost much," he says. "And it's for 2 days." I think he said 2 days or 3 days, 2 or 3 days. And they got this nice campground. He showed her the picture of the campground. I think it was the Earl Scruggs Bluegrass Festival or something like that he was going to go to. He was all excited. So I'll always remember, my dad had this big tent. It was an old, I think it was a Coleman brand tent, and it was back in the day when they didn't make tents out of that thin material they use now at nylon. They used to make them out of heavy duck canvas. And the tent was like, I think, orange and yellow and bright colors, And my dad always took really good care of that tent. He'd fold it up. I always remember him folding that tent. He'd fold it up lay it on the ground, then he'd step on it to push the canvas down flat. And then he'd fold it again, and he'd fold it, and then he'd step on it to get all the air out and push the canvas down flat. And when he got it done, it was just the size he could slide it into the trunk, including the tent poles. But he always used to take really good care of that tent. He'd mix up a mixture that he used to paint on the tent of paraffin wax and kerosene, and he had melted over a little stove, and he'd pitch the tent in the front yard, and then he would take the paintbrush, big wide paintbrush, and he'd paint the paraffin mixed with kerosene all over the duck canvas. And it made it hard like a rock, the duck canvas, But the tent had this certain smell inside, the smell of the paraffin and kerosene. And I don't know what there is about me that I just love the smell of that old tent. I mean, it wasn't real strong. I mean, it didn't reek, smell that way, but it had a nice, pleasant smell of that kerosene and that paraffin. So about a week before we were going to go, my dad laid the tent out in the front yard on the grass, and he pitched it up, and he painted it with the paraffin and kerosene mixture. And he left it out there to dry with all the windows open in the tent. So one of my memories for that particular period in time is, I remember one warm summer afternoon, I went out inside the tent, laid down on the floor, and I could smell all that. The breeze was blowing in the windows of the tent, but it still was pretty strong, the smell inside the tent of that paraffin in the kerosene, and I kind of loved the smell of that. I was just laying on the floor of the tent, looking up at the pretty colors of the ceiling, the oranges and yellows and everything. And my dad was just inside the house, on the other side of the window, about maybe 30 feet away, but the windows were open, and he was practicing his rolls. Pling, 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 pling. And then he'd play, you could hear him playing the Scruggs tape, listening, so that he could copy it. And then he would do the rolls. Pling, 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 pling. And I remember that pleasant summer afternoon, but while we were getting ready to leave to go to the Carolinas, laying there inside the tent, listening to my dad through the window, him plunging away at that banjo. So, time progressed, and we got to the time when we were going to leave to go to the mountains. And my dad just got him in the mail, his new tuners. And I mean, they were expensive. I think they were like $260 or something like that. I remember they were a lot of money back then, but they were these special Scruggs tuners or whatever, the quick tuners or whatever. So what they would do is they would make it so that you could do that thing in the song that they did like on Deliverance, where they the guy goes, kind of like it changes the tune of these special tuners, change the, with just a quick flick, he could change a couple of the notes on his banjo. And then he could adjust them back again with these tuners. So he's playing with these tuners, and he wanted to really practice with them when he went to the Bluegrass Festival he was planning on going to. So the Bluegrass Festival is only a couple days away then, at that point. We were all going to travel up to Carolinas and go to the Bluegrass Festival. And my grandparents are going to come with us on vacation too. So we were waiting in the yard. And my mother was like on the phone. What are we waiting for? My dad says, I got the car all packed. I got the tent in. I got everything in, ready to go. He says to my mother, he says, you ready to go? And she says, yeah, but she's on the phone with my grandmother over there and my grandfather. And they lived about 10 miles away. She's saying, asking, what's taking so long? My mother was on the phone. Like, what's taking so long? Why is it taking so long? My grandfather, he told her back. He said, well, my grandmother's packing. Well, she was packing all afternoon. 2 hours later, my mother called up. Says, well, what's taking so long? She's still packing, my grandfather said. My mother says, told her to hurry up. We want to get out and get on the road before dark. So I called a couple hours later. My mother was, why is it taking so long? My grandfather says, well, she's still packing a lot of stuff, and I'm carrying it out to the car and putting it in, and the car's nearly full, he said. Oh. Now, just before dark, they left and they came over, and they came driving in. My grandfather had this station wagon back then, and it was, I think it was a Dodge Colt station wagon, and that's what he was driving at that particular time. I think it was a little green colored Dodge Colt station wagon. And when he come driving up the little dirt road up to our house, my grandfather, the whole back end of that station wagon was packed right full up to the ceiling. You couldn't even see out the back windows. And the roof rack he had on the roof was all full of luggage. And he come up and he parked in our driveway. My dad says, what did she do? He used to call my grandfather Tom. He says, what'd she do, Tom? She says, did she take everything but the kitchen sink? And my grandmother was sitting there next to him in the car. She had this great big teacup that she always had. She always carried this big quart-sized teacup that was one of these thermos mugs right full of tea. And she was sitting there sipping at the tea. She had a big smile on her face. And everybody was kind of happy because everybody was getting ready to go. But she had quite literally taken everything that she could think to take with her in that car. And my grandfather been packing it all those hours, And she did have everything but the kitchen sink in that car. So we set out. And my father, he had this little Fiat car, and it was nearly new at the time. And he was test driving it. He wanted to see my father and my grandfather were in the used car business at that particular period in time. And it was a car that he had gotten from an auction house. And he wanted to try it for fuel economy because it was such a tiny car. It wasn't a real big car. It was a little Fiat. It was a little green Fiat car. And so my grandfather, when they left home, they said, my father said, I bet you I can beat you for gas mileage going up. Especially because you got all that stuff. And I think the car that my grandfather had a bigger engine in it. It was a considerably larger car. And it was all full of stuff. In fact, it was so full of stuff that it was just about squinching down the road when it went down the road. But he could get it up to speed, my grandfather. Even though it was so heavily loaded. Anyway, they both got out on the interstate. I think it was I-75. It started, or it might have been I-95. And they started to drive up toward the Carolinas. And they'd stop in the gas station and they'd both get exactly the same amount of gas. And wouldn't you know it, my grandfather, his big station wagon, actually beat my dad's Fiat in gas consumption. And my dad was awfully upset with that Fiat. The fact that it wouldn't give better gas mileage because it was a smaller car all the way around with a smaller engine and everything else. And it took more gas, about a third more gas than my dad's station wagon. My grandfather's station wagon. So they were in this little competition to see who could get the best gas mileage. So we arrived up in the Carolinas at this campground where we were going to have the Bluegrass Festival. And it was pretty nice the first day. Everybody was out in lawn chairs and there was little groups around like playing bluegrass music, just like practicing and stuff. And my dad was in his element, He walked from one of these little groups to the next one of these little groups with his banjo in his arms and hoping that he could join in, you know what I mean? And they were pretty friendly, and they did let him pluck along a little bit, but he wasn't really joined in that well because he wasn't as good a player as a lot of the guys that were there, were a lot better players. And he was really impressed with this young fella. This young fella was only about 12 years old and could just play circles around everybody else there. Anyway, so it went on all day, and there was a few bands and a few bands playing and stuff. And I think that was the Friday. And then Saturday came, and they had their big special events and everything, and their players and everything. And Friday, it was a nice day, but then Saturday, it started to rain in the afternoon. And a few notable things started to happen, One of the things was that it was a big hilly place, and one guy didn't put his parking brake on good, and his car got away from him and rolled down the hill in the campground. So we had a runaway car that afternoon, and it was raining that evening, and there was a lot of mud started to get there and everything, and we had our tent set up. My grandfather had one campsite right there, right next to us, and we had a campsite right next to them with our orange and yellow tent, and my grandfather, I think he had a green colored tent, and my grandmother were staying in at a campsite right next to us. We had a campfire and everything else going on. And then there was people parked on the other two campsites, one on our left and one on our right. So that Saturday night came along, and everybody was in a good mood at the whole campground. There's a lot of bluegrass music being played and bands. You could hear the band off in the distance playing. I think my dad was down at the band. So my dad, he listened to it up until around bedtime. He started to come back, around, I guess that was about 9 o'clock in the evening, back to the campsite. And you could hear the music off in the distance. Maybe, I don't know, maybe 200 or 300 yards away. They were playing. They had the stage set up, and they're playing on the stage still quite late into the evening, And my dad come back to the campsite, and you could just hear the music off in the distance, and I think we had a campfire going or whatever, and it was kind of a drizzly kind of an evening, and we were settling in, having supper and stuff, and my mother got everything ready for bed and everything else, and about 10 o'clock at night, my grandfather and my grandmother went into their tent, my mother and my father, and my mother had my bed set up, and because this tent was so big, I mean, the tent my dad had, it would like nowadays they would say it sleeps 30 people, because of the size of it, because it was like 12 by 16 or something. It was really big tent. My mother had my bed set up over one corner, and my parents had their bed set up over in the other corner of the tent, double-sized bed. I had a little single-sized bed, and we all went to bed, and we were laying there and starting to go ahead like we were going to go to sleep. And then my mother says, "What's that smell?" To my dad. "Do you smell it?" My dad was like, I don't smell anything. He was like, my mother says, No, I smell something. What's this? Just sniff this. What's that smell? She says, I know. What? And she unzipped. I heard her unzip the tent and go out. A couple minutes went by, She comes back in the tent. She says, I knew it. She says, I knew it. I knew I smelled it. She says, they're next to people in the tent next to us. They're smoking P.O.T., she says. My dad was like, what? She says, they're smoking P.O.T. My dad was like, what, are you kidding me? She says, no, I'm not kidding. She says, really, they're smoking P.O.T. to my dad. My dad was like, what? What are we going to do? And my parents were just like so upset about this. And then I see my mother go off next to next to the next campsite over where my grandparents were sleeping. And she scraped on their door and got them up. And she's telling my grandmother, whispering in my grandmother's ear. My grandmother's like, "Oh, my God." My grandmother was like, "Oh, my God, you're kidding me." And I was talking to my mother, and they're whispering back and forth. Oh, and then they were whispering to my grandfather, and he was like even more upset than my grandmother. And then my father was getting upset because all four of them were getting upset, but they weren't saying nothing. They were all just whispering around the campsite. P.O.T. They're whispering to it, P.O.T. P.O.T. Oh, no. Oh, no. All upset, all upset. We got to get out of here. My grandmother and grandfather were like, "Oh, no, we can't stay here. We can't stay here. If they're smoking, if they're doing drugs. Oh, my God, they're doing drugs. This is horrible." My mother was like, "Oh, no. We got to go. We got to go. We can't stay here. Imagine the effect it'll have on our child. We can't stay here. Oh, my goodness. I can smell it. I can smell it." She said, "I can smell it. Yeah. Oh, no, I can smell it." My grandmother's saying to her, whispering back and forth. So that was it. It was about 11 o'clock at night. And they were saying to me, and I was only like a little 15-year-old kid, they said, "Well, that's it. We got to pack up the tent. We got to pack up everything. Pack up everything." And my dad says, "Well, what about our tickets? We paid for our tickets, and they're going to have a nice show all day Sunday." No. We can't stay here because they're doing drugs. The police might come. They might raid the place. We might all end up in jail. My mother was like, and my dad was like, "Oh, my God, yeah, okay. He was saying, okay. My dad was saying, okay. So that was it. Everything was being packed into the cars. The tents was being packed up at 11:30 at night. "Where are we going to go?" "It's late." My dad said, "Late." My grandfather was like, "Where are we going to go?" So we all headed out in the middle of the night. We were out of there. And there wasn't any campsites open. So we were on the road. We were all driving. And I can't remember exactly how it worked out. Right? But we did find a campsite someplace. I think what happened was we drove for about 4 hours until it started to get, or 5 hours until it started to get about light, the sun started to break the next morning. Just driving. And I think my grandfather spotted this little picnic site that was like a turn-off picnic site on the side of the road someplace or something. And they went and they pitched there. They slept the 3 or 4 more early morning hours, like from about 4 a.m. till maybe 5 a.m. and up until about 11 o'clock in the morning. And then they left and went and found another campground the next day. But that wasn't it with the banjo thing. On the way back home, my dad went out of the way for about 300 miles out of the way to visit some guy who had some sort of a banjo-making workshop in his basement. And he knocked on the guy's door. And the guy was very nice, He gave my dad a tour. And I think it was the place where my dad had bought the tone ring for his banjo. I think he looked up the guy's address and went to see him. And I remember doing this tour, going down through the guy's basement, and he had some sort of a lathe or something, and he he melted the brass, and I think he hand smelted the brass or something. And he had some sort of a forge or something. He showed my dad all the stuff and how he had made the tone ring and everything. And for that afternoon, and my dad was in a really good mood, And I think my dad bought a couple things off of him or something. I can't remember on the way back home. But that wasn't the end of the banjo thing. The banjo thing went on for a few more years until my dad did get tired of it. My dad got tired of it because he could never really learn to play the banjo properly. I mean, he really put a lot of effort into that. And he did get, toward the end, before he gave up, he did get actually pretty good at playing the banjo. But he just couldn't quite get those, licks or whatever, where they strum it in a certain way, or finger picking. He couldn't quite get it to where it was really smooth. like the professionals and stuff, you know. He got it pretty good, where it sounded pretty good. He could almost play in a band. Almost. He got it too, but with tremendous amounts of practice. But those are good memories of those years back then, in those days. Thank you guys for listening. Like and subscribe, and we'll catch you guys in the next episode Monday morning. You guys have a great rest of the weekend. Bye-bye.